I tested every major emulator on the Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5 to see how far Android gaming has really come in 2026. From 3DS and Switch to PS2, PS3, PC, and even Xbox 360. I ran real gameplay tests tracking FPS, stability, and long session performance. Some emulators blew me away, some still need work, and a few are already close to console level. First, we will try PS2 emulation, which is one of the most mature systems on Android right now, and I tested Nether SX2, PPSS22, and Play with multiple heavy titles. God of War 1 and 2, Resident Evil 4, and Grand Theft Auto. San Andreas ran at a locked 60 frames per second in most compatible scenes on Nether SX2 when Vulkan was enabled. Nether SX2's scalability allowed resolution up to 3 times or 4 times, even 8 times, while maintaining strong stability. And even during intense action sequences, frame pacing remained smooth thanks to optimized Vulkan backend performance. PPSS22 also performed very well, averaging between 50 to 60 frames per second depending on the title, and Final Fantasy X showed playable performance with few visual artifacts. However, in longer 45+ minute sessions, Nether SX2 showed slightly better consistency and fewer unexpected slowdowns. On modern Snapdragon hardware, PS2 emulation now feels surprisingly close to native levels if you pick the right core and driver settings. Playing classic PS2 titles on the Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5 is impressively smooth. Naruto Shippuden, Ultimate Ninja 3 run beautifully in high resolution via Nether SX2, while Resident Evil 4 maintains a consistent 55 to 60 FPS. Soul Calibur 3 and FIFA 13 performs well on Play PS2 emulator, though occasional frame drops occur. Overall, PS2 gaming on this hardware feels near flawless with Nether SX2's Vulkan pipeline, although certain games still benefit from careful upscaling tweaks. Then we will try another most demanding console. For Nintendo 3DS emulation, I tested Azahar and Mandarine, currently the 2 strongest 3DS emulators on Android. Azahar performed exceptionally well with Pokémon X, Super Mario 3D Land, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, all running at a stable 60 FPS with minimal frame drops, even during combat-heavy scenes or large open areas. Recent Azahar builds also include significant latency and UI improvements. Frame pacing was smooth, input latency low, and thermals stayed controlled during 40 to 60-minute sessions. Mandarine also performed well, typically averaging between 55 to 60 frames per second depending on the title. But in direct comparison, Azahar felt slightly more polished and better optimized overall. Its official Play Store availability also makes installation easier for most users. On the Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5, classic 3DS emulators perform impressively. Mario Kart 7 runs at a stable 60 frames per second on Citron. Super Mario 3D Land on Lime is buttery smooth, and Dragon Ball Fusions on Citron MMJ experiences only minor dips. Overall, both Azahar and Mandarine emulators are highly capable, but Azahar's superior responsiveness and stability make it the top choice for daily 3DS gaming on Android. Now we will try the current most popular system. Switch emulation is where things get really interesting. There are multiple projects like Eden, Citron, Nushu, Kenji NX, and Sumi, but I focused mainly on Eden and Citron for stability and performance comparison. I heavily tested The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, including open-world exploration, combat, and shrine sections. The game averaged 30 FPS with dips into the mid-20s during dense forests or physics-heavy moments, while frame pacing remained surprisingly smooth after shader caches built up. Super Mario Odyssey performed even better, staying between 55 to 60 frames per second in most stages, and Dragon Ball FighterZ maintained 30 frames per second with consistent performance. Eden supports gyro controls, save states, external controllers, and extensive custom GPU driver features, which noticeably improved demanding titles. Citron delivered similar FPS numbers, but during longer 1-hour sessions, Eden felt slightly more stable with fewer shader stutters and random dips. On the Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5, Nintendo Switch emulation shows promising results. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom runs on Eden but remains CPU heavy. Bayonetta performs well on Citron, and Super Mario 3D World on Sumi maintains a stable 30 frames per second. While performance heavily depends on emulator builds and background driver support, Switch gaming is playable in many cases with proper configuration, though it's not yet flawless. Next, we will try PS3 emulation, which is showing early promise but remains very challenging on Android. With a PS3e and RPCSX UI Android, I tested lightweight PS3 titles, homebrew, and even pushed things further with God of War 3 to stress the hardware. Lighter titles range 20 to 35 frames per second depending on optimization, with some games hovering near stable 30 frames per second in smaller environments, though shader stutters and drops are still present. God of War 3 successfully booted and reached gameplay on a PS3e, delivering between 15 to 25 frames per second with heavier drops during combat and cinematic sequences still not fully playable, but clearly showing the immense power of Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5 when given enough driver pipeline support. Between the two emulators, a PS3e feels more experimental with occasional crashes, while RPCSX UI Android offered slightly better long session stability and smoother overall behavior. PS3 emulation on Android is showing early promise but remains challenging. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 runs at decent FPS on RPCS 3 Android Dragon Ball. Raging Blast performs reasonably on APS-3E, and DMC stays lighter, hovering closer to 30 frames per second. Overall, PS3 emulation is playable in parts, offering glimpses of performance, but it's still on the bleeding edge and far from fully polished. After that, we will try Xbox 360 emulation, which is extremely complex. AX360E is currently the only serious Android project under development. It's based on a port of the well-known PC Xbox 360 emulator but remains in early stages. Lightweight demos and homebrew applications ran 15 to 30 frames per second, and I tested titles like Dance, It's Your Stage and Sea Life Safari, some menus fully rendered and played smoothly, though gameplay scenes often encountered missing rendering parts or crashes. Games like GTA San Andreas did boot and render but suffered audio issues and graphical glitches. Full 3A titles remain mostly unplayable presently, with FPS varying widely depending on game and scene complexity. Games tested include Resident Evil 5, which runs decently and can reach completion, showing the current progress of the emulator. Grand Theft Auto 4 can open menu, but the gameplay is still limited and not fully stable. Meanwhile, Flat-Out Ultimate Carnage is technically playable, although it suffers from bugs and glitches. Overall, Xbox 360 emulation on Android is still in a very early yet promising stage, but it remains far from practical for mainstream everyday use. Finally, we will try PC gaming on Android. I tested GameHub and Winlator alongside alternatives like Horizon Emulator and Zodos. For PC gaming, I tested GameHub and Winlator alongside alternatives like Horizon and Zodos. Lighter PC titles ran between 40 to 60 FPS depending on optimization, while heavier games required lowering resolution and graphics settings to maintain 30 FPS stability. I also tested GTA 4 and GTA 5 on both emulators. GTA 4 ran 25 to 35 frames per second on low settings with noticeable drops in busy city areas, and GTA 5 averaged 20-30 frames per second depending on scene complexity and tweaks. GameHub generally felt smoother overall with stable frame pacing and lower input delay, while Winlator delivered similar performance but required more manual tuning and configuration for best results. With proper setup, the experience feels surprisingly close to low-end PC gaming on a desktop, though input latency and thermal constraints are still limitations. PC gaming on Android has reached impressive levels of realism with emulation. GTA 4 runs smoothly on GameHub, while GTA 5 performs well through Winlator. Even more demanding titles like Hollow Knight on Horizon emulators achieve 40 to 50 frames per second with proper configuration. Overall, PC emulation on Android now offers a genuinely playable experience for lighter and moderately demanding games when settings are carefully optimized. After testing these emulators, one thing is clear. The Snapdragon Elite 8 Gen 5 can handle games that once needed multiple consoles or a PC. From Nintendo 3DS and Switch to PS2, Wii U, PS3, PC gaming, and even Xbox 360, this setup is capable of both retro and modern gaming in your pocket.